Hello friends, welcome to the EduSat Network. Our today's topic of discussion, in fact the title is Writing in India and Introduction, and this is also the first lecture of our series that we will be having now on writing in India. And for this discussion we have this in our studio Dr. Anand Prakash, retired professor, English Literature, University of Delhi. He has a teaching experience of more than 4 decades, and one of his books relevant in this regard is Interventions, which is also used as a textbook in Delhi University. And with this brief introduction, I would like to welcome Sir to our EduSat studio and also request him to begin our today's lecture. Thank you for coming, sir.
Thank you, Urvashi, and welcome viewers. Today we begin with, as Urvashi has pointed out, a new series of discussions, and this begins with the discussion titled Writing in India, an Introduction. It's a vast territory. India, what does one mean by India? And writing, then which time segment, all these things are relevant to the needs of this particular topic. I will not go very systematically and historically and with a kind of survey. That's not my job. I'll merely introduce a few important features of the writing that we have to talk about, discuss, and since it's a very vast topic, historically and geographically and from the contemporary point of view, I'll be picking up points and referring to texts which give me an occasion to make certain points. And I start by this particular point, which is, I have noted it down, I'll read out to you. Writing in India is a vague term, and our job here is not to trace its origins or to define it in precise terms. You can't define because it's such a big time segment. Instead, we may mention randomly a few old texts that include Ramayana, Mahabharata, Panchatantra, Katha Sarit Sagar, Jataka Tales, Abhigyana Shakuntalam, Raghuvansh, Mritshakatikam, Swapna Vasav Shilapati Garam, Harsh Charit, Prithviraj Raso, Padmavat, among others. There will be a large number of texts which come under this category of important writing in India. And these particular works that I have cited, they relate to ancient India or early medieval India. And I didn't mention specifically the authors because the author's part is relatively less known, and there's no point just naming names. Therefore, I have just referred to the texts. Ramayana, of course, was written by Valmiki, as you all know, and it's a Sanskrit text. It's not the kind of Sanskrit that is spoken later in India. It belongs to the genuinely ancient period, and those who have read this book and have seen other versions of Ramayana, of the same narrative, all across centuries, and there must be hundreds of Ramayanas written by different people in different languages. The most famous one is that which is written by Tulsidas in the medieval period. Tulsidas lived in Akbar's time, and that was in Awadhi, not even in Hindi or any recognized language, but a kind of dialect at that time. And he attempted an epic, and the title he gave was not Ramayana, it was called Ramcharitmanas. So most of the people in North India, and particularly in this Uttar Pradesh, it's called today, and Lucknow and Banaras, that area, these people speak Awadhi, and it is a household name. People perhaps do perform a kind of puja, also do a part, and then they sing together, and that's what Ramcharitmanas is. And that is based on this Ramayana that I talked about from Valmiki. You have Mahabharata. One doesn't know which is older, whether Ramayana is older or Mahabharata is older. There are debates about it. But if you go to the scenario, you find that Mahabharata is a little more political than Ramayana. Ramayana emphasizes the ethics of the family, among other things. Of course, there are scholars who suggest that Ramayana also is to do with, changing of hands at the political level, that one person is sent out and the other assumes office, and that this was a political act. Bharat, for instance, must have somehow, some scholars have even said that Bharat may have wished to become the king. Of course, this is not there in Ramcharitmanas, but then there is a politics behind the happenings in Ramayana at that time. But one thing specifically that I point out in this Ramayana written by Valmiki is that Ram is not supposed to be as godly a figure as he became later in other versions of Ramayana. This is to be kept in mind. In fact, the character of Ram in Valmiki is supposed to be rather human, and the tears that he sheds or the happiness that he expresses are genuine, and he behaves acts like a human being, and that way he is closer to us than Tulsidas's Ram, who all the time reminds us, and the poet also reminds us that, well, it's not the human being, it's God himself who has assumed the role of God, and therefore role of a king, and therefore he is behaving this way. So do not take him too seriously and literally. So that's how these epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, they have been in the collective memory of India for a very long time. Then you have a book of short stories, a book of stories called Panchatantra, and it's maybe 5 sections of it, and in each section some kind of lesson is given. Then you have Katha Sarit Sagar. It's a sagar, it's an ocean of short stories, so you can imagine how many short stories would there be, and all of them are woven. And interesting thing about Panchatantra, Katha Sarit Sagar, and the next one, Jataka Tales, is that these the authorship is not very clear, because somebody is telling, but then this person would have heard from elsewhere these stories, and he is in a way retelling. In fact, one of the surmises, one of the guesses is that these stories traveled from one part of the world to another. When traders would go to other parts of the world to trade, then at night they'll relax and tell one another stories, and these stories, then somebody would have written them down and given them a form and a narrative, a pattern, and that's how these books came into being in their present form. Then you have Abhigyana Shakuntalam. This is one of the great plays written by Kalidas, and this talks about the knowledge, the awareness of Shakuntala, the heroine. Now imagine that in the ancient period also some kind of importance was given to women, and it's a woman-oriented text. Then you have Raghuvansh, as is clear, it's the family of Raghu, and then it's an epic in the new classical mode by Kalidas again, and there the entire family tree of Raghu is traced in the verse form, and it's a very elevated kind of verse, and there are different meters in it, and these and each section, each sarga they call it, each chapter, whatever, or canto, each canto uses a specific meter in this book, and it's really, as I said, very elevated in style. Then you have Mritsha Katikam, another text which is not exactly Sanskrit. It uses Sanskrit, but this also uses Prakrit, and the way Sanskrit would be spoken by the common people, that the influence that they have on the language as they speak, and it has the taste, it has the flavor of the ancient spoken languages at that time, and strangely it doesn't have a story about a king or a queen, as is the case with most of the ancient texts. It's a story about thieves. It's a story about pickpockets. It's a story about people who visit harlots and whores, and there are there is a kind of hypocrisy that rich people maintain in their life. At home they are very respectable, but in the evening, at night, when they visit the courtesans, etc., then their behavior becomes different. And that such a text has survived shows that India was not all that within quotes, straightforward kind of a culture of a country, and that all kinds of people lived and they enjoyed in their own way. And this is the only play by the writer whose name is very significantly Shudrak. Shudrak, the lowest caste. One doesn't know whether the person belonged to the low caste or not, but then he preferred to call himself Shudrak. And this Shudrak really tells about the supposedly lower levels of life and culture at that time, and it's a very famous text even today. Every second or third year it must be performed in some part of India. In Delhi there are many versions of it that have been presented in the last many years, and there is a whole film called Utsav, in which Shashi Kapoor and Rekha I think acted, and that's a famous film that was more or less entirely based on Mritsyakatikam. Then you have Swapna Vasavadattam, a play by Bhas, and in this play you have a kind of romance plus politics, and the kings they use even their matrimony for political purposes, and some scene behind the some action behind the drama also happens. So it's a very cleverly woven presentation in which the characters are very lively, and at the same time they live in some kind of a dilemma all the time, and the writer is using a large number of stage techniques here, and through these techniques the writer is able to tell different layers of reality. Then you have Harsh Charit, as is known. It's the biography or kind of charit of the king Harsh, in the I think 6th, 7th century. I'm not sure about the dates, and so anyway, and because the writer is telling you about the details of life of a king, therefore much will be enlightened in terms of the aspects of life that would be present at that time. Then there is another which is kind of Harsh Charit. This is called Prithviraj Raso, an epic, whose hero is Prithviraj, who is in the I think 11th or 12th centuries. Then you have Padmavat. It's a Prithviraj Raso and Padmavat. They are not in Sanskrit. Harsh Charit is in Sanskrit. Sorry, I skipped Shalpadigaram. Shalpadigaram is a text from South India, and in this text, there is a kind of love triangle. There is a kind of triangle in which there is a husband, there is a wife, and there is a third woman, the courtesan or the dancer, etc. And through that triangle, a kind of parable is created, and it's a very powerful poem of the early medieval period, and it is still taught in certain universities. I think Delhi University has this text as a part of the Indian writing course. Then you have Padmavat. Padmavat is about the queen Padma, and it's her story, and the folklore has it that such a woman existed in Rajasthan, and that she was the cynosure of all eyes, and people wanted to marry her, and how she was able to how she was approached by different kings, and finally, but then because this is the early medieval period, so the writer, I think it's Jayasi, this writer is dealing with the story at different levels. At the level of metaphor, where Padmavat actually is human soul or human beauty or some kind of a symbol. And so what is common to all these tales? All of them were written in India. So they are true indicators of writing in India in the ancient and early medieval period. And what is common to them? In my opinion, what is common is that they do not talk about the experience of the author at all. No author is self-reflexive in these tales. The attention of the author is always focused upon something else outside himself. I am saying himself because there are very few women writers at that time. The second thing is that they work at different levels. So they cannot be taken as historical accounts, even though we fight over certain texts like Mahabharata and Ramayana today, and we say this is wrong and that is right. But then they are all tales, and they their length is not specified in many cases, except the natakas or the dramas. In the epics, the length is never specified. It can continue into many more versions later, etc. And the third thing is that even though they revolve around Sanskrit, the classical language, or Tamil, which is the classical language of the south, in the case of Shilpadigaram, but then they venture into areas which take us to the level of ordinary human beings. It can happen at the level of characters. It can happen also at the level of imagery, and imagery can also be of nature. In Shilpadigaram, there is a very big chunk of the imagery that is associated with water, with the sea, and with the seasons, and there are songs built into the text which celebrate the influence of or the inspiration from nature. So they have a big sweep, and this sweep might have worked to the advantage of writers that followed. I don't want to go into ancient India literature because that is way behind us, and we can draw inspiration from there, but we live in a different period, and our concerns are basically the modern concerns, the concerns of the 20th century, 19th century, or 21st century now, and the connection being so very distant between us and these texts. We can always look back at them for inspiration and for variety and for metaphors. For instance, we can rewrite our own Ramayana, our own Mahabharata in today's conditions. So this way, we have this heritage, and we enjoy and celebrate this heritage all the time. For instance, in North India in particular, and in the whole of India in general, lots of male and female names come from these texts. And Ram is quite common. In fact, Ram is not merely a name in India; it's also a surname. So there will be millions of people, in India in the 20th century, whose names ended with Ram, Bharat Ram and Charat Ram. These are the big industrialists in India, and ordinary people, Ram Dulare, so Ram comes first. So that kind of a thing. So one realizes that they then are a part of the collective memory, and they always inspire us in our life today as characters or as texts. And innumerable quotations are used by us from these texts, either in the original or in some kind of a distorted form. So we can say in Hindi, for instance, "Tum kaun se Ram ho," and so there is a reference to that kind of a thing. And the whole picture that is there, in Ramayana, that comes out clearly. So the point I am making here is that India per se can be defined in terms of the cultural ethos that is enshrined in these ancient texts, and that we will go back and forth in time to understand what actually India means to us. And one particular source, and a very precious source, very rich source, would be the ancient writing that I talked about. Then I move on to the second point, which is connected with this, and I say the linguistic and literary evolution continued through millennia. So I'm talking about 2 millennia, the first century to the 10th century, and from 10th to the 20th, 2 millennia. And language and literature both evolved in these 2000 years, which is, since we have done literary theory, so we know that languages grow, languages die out, languages become stale, they become fixed, and therefore people go against them, which is the case with all classical languages in India. Classical language, Sanskrit for instance, is not spoken by many people today, and people have initially may have spoken a kind of language which was close to Sanskrit, but very soon, because Sanskrit was tied down to a very strict grammar like Latin or Latin in Europe, therefore people would not be bound down by grammatical rules when they wanted to say. Human expression actually is human assertion, and if anything comes in the way of human assertion, then human beings revolt. This is human beings' nature. they will not allow their nature to be countered by any kind of restriction. And since grammatical rules of classical languages always give preference to the rules and not to the intent, therefore people would use them for some purposes, but not for the ordinary purpose of communicating their ideas with others. There is something to be said in favor of the classical languages at the same time, because they have specific rules, and because they are very precise in their constructions, and since scholars in all parts of the country or the subcontinent or the neighboring countries can approach not the direct spoken language but the classical language, the scholars can do that. Therefore, the information, experience, poetry, aesthetics, they can be preserved better in a classical language. That's why even though we don't speak those languages, we don't generally read those texts, but if there is any need to read those texts, then we can go back to the classical language, we can learn it, and then the thing is presented there in a relatively pure form. So that can be said about the use of classical languages, which were the languages that in which the ancient writing was written, and then human beings being human beings, and their experience guiding them more than the rules that were behind them in history. Therefore, they will make regularly experiment with language, with expression, with words. They will coin new words under the stress of circumstance, and that's how languages evolve. So I think it's beyond doubt that languages change from time to time, and then they move in a certain direction. That direction is by and large guided by the experience that human beings have at a different point of time. What about evolution of literature? Does literature also develop and evolve? And this question, Roshi, what do you say? What is your answer to this? And does literature also evolve like language?
Sir, I would definitely say that it does evolve and develop because it moves along with language, sir. It requires the use of language, and of course without language there cannot be any literature. And so just as language evolves and people are writing, I think the style of literature, the style of writing, and the kind of writings that you mentioned, there's poetry, drama, and then there's epic style. So that also evolves, and then we have later then we had novel. And
another question, suppose a person comes from outside, or a community shifts from one place to another, or we ourselves go to another place and we come in touch with a different kind of a literature. Do we also have a kind of give and take with that literature?
Sir, I would definitely agree with that, because when we learn something new, we definitely look at the things that we can imbibe from that, and what are in fact the good things or the very interesting things that we could include to make our literature more interesting in that sense.
Which means that at the level of literature also we keep on evolving. We keep on learning and teaching others.
Yes.
So that give and take is there, and it is through this kind of a give and take that literature also evolves.
It develops.
There can be a third thing also, Urvashi, I don't know whether you would agree. The third thing is that the experience of the common masses, those experiences may not be found very clearly expressed in established literature, but that experience is there, and therefore some kind of folk literature becomes necessary in order to give expression to the common masses. So is there a folk tradition also in literature which will run parallel to the established literature?
Definitely, sir. We have folk tales, and we have, but that's a lot of oral literature, so that runs parallel, and we often find references to those in our works of literature. But of course, many of those have not been restored into written forms, but continue as oral retellings of stories that we may have even heard from our grandparents, and which we continue to hear today, but they also exist in say different forms. There might be variations even within the folk tales.
And now that we have talked of oral literature, also tell me please whether a literature that is sung, is it oral literature?
Definitely, sir. I would say that.
And now the interesting part is that the literature that I'm now coming to, the medieval literature, that will be mostly available through songs which are actually sung by people.
Yes,
so there won't be any written text there,
Yes.
and people would not read, but they will hear the songs. And these songs, will give a specific color, a specific texture to the word, to the phrase, etc. In the song, and music will add its own value
Definitely,
to the
sir.
song. There is lilting kind of a thing, meter, and there will be different kind of a meter. Singing is different from talking. So that will enrich, I think, the effect of literature, and literature will learn a great deal from
Absolutely,
this
sir.
tradition of singing.
Yes, sir.
So you agree there?
I agree. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. So the next point that I then make is that rich literary cultural heritage of ancient and early medieval writing forms a backdrop to what came to be known as devotional poetry in the medieval period. Now we are moving from the ancient India to the medieval period, and of course the dark side of the medieval life is that people were not very literate, and it was of course a changing world in the medieval period also. So not medieval in the sense in which we use the term in Europe. Still, a large chunk of the masses was not a part of social life in that sense in which you understand the term. And these people had no literacy, and in fact, till the other day, even today, half of India is illiterate, or very only meagerly literate, and they have their own way of expressing joy, sorrow, pain, anguish, etc. But then that is done only orally, as Urushi pointed out, in oral writing, etc. And when things become too much with us, to use Wordsworth's phrase, when they hang heavy on our head, on our consciousness, then we want to somehow sustain ourselves with something. Then in the evening we sit down and we chant certain things. We want to sing together with others, and that singing gives us a kind of joy. And maybe at that point of time, we are in communion with a spirit. We don't know what that spirit is, and somehow we relax, and we become a bit light with respect to our burdens that we carry during the day. So this might be the reason why in the medieval period a kind of poetry emerged that could be called devotional. I don't know whether the word devotional does full justice to bhakti, which is used in North India in particular. There are bhakti poets, there are saint poets, and there are poets who worship God, and worship God as in the human form, as a figure, as an avatar, and they visualize God sitting or standing in front of them, and they talk to God. They hold a kind of dialogue with God. So this kind of a poetry is written in the medieval period, and it is sung, and it is sung together with others. For instance, the arati. The arati is sung together, and it's an address to God, and it's a God which is visualized, or who is visualized as a human figure who speaks, who listens to us, who understands us, who guides us also. So this is called devotional poetry, and in this devotional poetry, India is very rich. And I'll take up some poets of this variety in specific discussions. But then there is a kind of poetry in medieval India which addresses the God in the human figure, and there's a kind of a dialogue, and when you are in front of God, your God, or the God that you have chosen to admire and worship, then it's a kind of a poetry which shows you in a very modest light. Human beings, admit to others, that they have very modest, origins, and they are very normal, weak people, and they require strength, and only God can give them strength so that they can survive in the life, which is full of struggle and all. So these songs were written by people, and then they were sung by many others in the neighborhood, in the city, and across the cities to other places. And this is because God was visualized as a human figure. So there was a word given to it by these poets and by critics who talked about these things, and that is called sagun. Sagun is the sagun means with characteristics, with human characteristics. So when God is visualized as a human being, like if you write in praise of Lord Krishna, so in a way you are talking about that Krishna who is the lover of Radha, that Krishna who was the lover of gopis, and whom gopis also loved, and there was a kind of communication at the equal level, and people danced with Krishna, Lord Krishna, and there are songs where Lord Krishna is invited by women to dance with them and guide them and be with them and be happy with them and all those things, and people celebrated these things. So this is called saguna. So this person, this God, Lord Krishna, actually is a human being who is communicating with the other ordinary people, and then he is giving them joy. He is giving them an occasion to celebrate. Ram is the same figure. So famous song written by Tulsidas and set to music and used in Hindi films and other films. That's quite common, and this is one aspect of devotional poetry that existed in India in the medieval period. There was another aspect of devotional poetry where Ram was not visualized as a human figure, but as an idea. And this particular trend was called Nirgun poetry, where the human traits will not be important for the understanding of Ram. So Ram is a symbol of certain qualities, symbol of certain attitudes. Ram may be used as an instrument of criticizing those who are too much bogged down by tradition and orthodoxy. And these people would say that if you have to really understand the ways of Ram, then you have to look inwards rather than outward to a figure. And this poetry also became quite strong in India, and particularly in North India, where a very abstract kind of idea was supposed to be captured by these people. So I would say that the bhakti poets of the Sagun variety were basically worshippers, admirers, and people with feeling and experience. Whereas those who visualize God as a symbol of qualities, they were more philosophically oriented. So they would not write much about emotions. They would write about ideas, and they would interpret in their own manner what is called the philosophy that one should have, one should accept, and one can also reject and present one's point of view. And to this Nirguna poetry, maybe the word is not very happy in the case, but this Nirguna poetry, to this belongs people like Kabir. So Kabir, would not do any idol worship. He'll call it idol worship, and I'll talk about Kabir maybe later. But then these two strands, they are there in the medieval poetry, and they became so very important at that point of time as a cultural form. Would you like to ask
yes,
something?
sir, I would like to ask you a question. So we were talking about devotional poetry and the two schools you mentioned, Sagun and Nirgun. So I want to ask whether, say in the medieval period, the devotional poetry was sung purely in classical languages, or like we talked about folk tales and folk songs in the were they also sung in local languages at that time?
Oh, that's an important question. You see, there is a total departure from the classical languages here. The poets are writing in the common idiom. They are writing not merely in an accepted language, but in a dialect, and they borrow a large number of words from actual situations, or they coin words to meet those situations, and it's the spoken language of the first order. It's a first straight spoken language, very fresh, very living, very charming. It works like magic, on people who hear. And I think best examples of language are found in in the medieval bhakti poetry, whether it is the Sagun or the Nirgun variety. So definitely this was very close to the masses. In fact, masses' energy and their emotions, it is these that are reflected in this poetry, and their God is the God of the masses. For instance, Nirdhan ke Dhan Ram, Nirbal ke Balaram. So now see the plumbing on the word. Balaram is a name, and Bal means strength. So the strength of Ram, etc. So these have become household phrases today, just because the bhakti poetry actually came from, it was inspired by the ordinary experiences of people, and those experiences were down to earth. Those experiences anybody could relate to, and think of oneself in the same position that the writer was when he wrote about these things. And the other thing which you suggest indirectly, that is implied in your statement, is that since this commonality, this commonness, this rather supposedly lower level of consciousness, this was there more in the case of women. They were further deprived the benefits of even thinking, and so therefore a large number of women poets came forward, and they articulated their experiences, etc., through poetry. I'm not sure how much Mirabai would have got education. She was a princess, yes, and maybe some people came and taught her certain things, but there are other women. There is a woman in Kashmir, there is a woman in the south, and there are people here also. And these women, they coin their own phrases. So that way, why medieval poetry, supposedly medieval poetry, this bhakti poetry is so very powerful in terms of poetic content, is that they are down to earth, and that they never leave that particular situation which is human centered. So it's in spite of bhakti poetry so called, it's a very secular poetry. And now the avatar Ram or Krishna, they are very secular people. They don't make any distinction between this and that person, this and that caste, etc. In fact, they are on the side of the lower caste. They are on the side of the average masses, and to that extent, they appear to us sometimes as lovers, sometimes as people with bodies, sometimes people who guide us and take us along with them. So that is the charm of this devotional poetry of the medieval period. So this is how I interpret this.
Thank you, sir.
That that classical language has been totally forgotten. Not only forgotten, they come under attack. Now imagine the story of Ram would require some kind of knowledge of Sanskrit, and Tulsidas himself was a great scholar of Sanskrit. Tulsidas has composed a large number of verses in Sanskrit, but when he came to writing about Ram, then he chose Avadhi. Then he didn't choose Sanskrit. He could easily write as many shlokas as one wanted, but he wanted to communicate his version of Ram to the ordinary masses in their language. So in fact, if Milton in the 17th century has to write about God and Adam and Satan, etc., he uses an English which is very close to Latin. In fact, when we teach Milton, then we use the word Latinism. So he's all the time using long sentences, and he's not following English grammatical rules. But in the case of India, and these people appeared little before Milton, these people wanted to express the subtlest of ideas, the subtlest of expressions and experiences in the language of the common masses.
Right,
so that is quite surprising and fascinating, that simple language can be used as a vehicle of very difficult ideas. So I am that way a great admirer of the Indian writing of this period, because it is this writing which holds us in some kind of a state of fascination even today. Then I go further. Writing in India in the ancient period, like its counterparts in other countries, did not make a distinction between religion, philosophy, poetry, ethics, planetary movements, medicine and politics. So all these things were combined. So there's nothing like this is artistic and this is non-artistic. This is ethical and this is material. There was no distinction of that kind at all. This is the case with most of the ancient Greek writings also, where religion, philosophy, poetry and politics, etc., all of them combined, integrated. And the same is true about the Indian writing, not merely in the ancient period but also in the medieval period. Because very soon you realize that Kabir may not be a poet, who is giving poetic pleasure to the listener, but some kind of a teacher. And he's rebuking, he's scolding the audience as parents would scold, and he would give a whole lesson in some kind of morality. So that is also there. So morality, philosophy, religion, education, all of them are combined so well in these things, as if the whole thing is just one big unified mass of knowledge. So this is the point which can be explained with a large number of examples, but then one has to move to the next idea. With the passage of time, though, diversification and differentiation occurred. This always happens as humankind moves forward, as the ways of living become different. So things become more and more differentiated. They get divided into parts, and when those parts further develop, then those parts look unlike other parts. So that kind of differentiation occurs. So maybe later on there will be religious books, there will be moral books, there will be ethical books, there will be conventional books, and there will be poetry. So that differentiation which is there in life, that differentiation also starts occurring at the level of literature. And as you reach the 19th century and 20th century, you realize that a poem is a poem, and a religious tract is a religious tract. The two can't come together. So that kind of a thing is there. And there are poets who don't go to temples, and there are people in the temples who don't read poetry, because already that kind of schism has occurred between the two. With the passage of time, diversification and differentiation occurred, and specific literary forms emerged. Now, initially the narrative is there in both epics. It can be there in long poems also, and in Tulsidas there is a narrative. Later on, and Tulsidas's language is very close to prose, but then it is not prose. Later on, when prose comes and the narrative is maintained, then this prose in India, of course, I'll go into that much later. In India, it might become a novel. The novel as a form did not emerge in India as naturally as it might have emerged in England. But in the latter half of the 19th century onwards, you have seeds of the novel writing, which is a form, and which in the 20th century in India, novel has become the predominant form. So this diversification has occurred. Now people, of course, give narratives and poems also, but then narrative now belongs more to the prose. So from the medieval period to the modern period, and starting from 19th century onwards, you see what is called diversification. There are different forms of poetic expression in the 19th century. There are songs, there are ghazals, there are longer poems, there are comments, all these things. And of course, in the medieval poetry, you had dohas, which is an independent form. You had a chaupai, which is 4 lines. Doha means 2 lines. Chaupai means 4 lines. And like this, these forms, and then they become rigid. And there are certain rules that have to follow. And there are different meters, which will be popular in the 17th, 18th century onwards. And that's how, this diversification and then experimentation. These are the 2 words that I have highlighted. These, become the hallmarks of poetry when it moves towards the modern period. I've already, explained viewers these terms earlier, but then I will repeat them. Saguna and Nirguna, devotional poetry. Then there is mysticism there, where you don't have God as avatar, God as a human figure. There you have mysticism, because then you talk of certain abstract things. You have Sufism. Sufism means when you talk about the purity of the individual, and not bending down to any traditional view, and asserting oneself and one's charms. That is Sufism. So it's very close to mysticism. For instance, Kabir may not be a Sufi poet, but then he takes influence from Sufism, in the sense that he takes a stance which is his own, and where he talks about his soul. He talks about him as an instrument of something else, and because he becomes an instrument in the hands of God or somebody, that God who is not there, which is not there, but only as an idea, then in that particular state, Kabir goes very close to Sufism. Then there is philosophy in the poetry of the period, and this philosophy may not be the logically conceived and articulated philosophy as in the hands of a trained philosopher or an established philosopher, but then in the Indian writing in the medieval period, you have philosophical observations on life and other issues. Then love is an important theme of this poetry in the medieval devotional poetry. Sexuality is very much there, particularly in Mira's poetry. You can see assertion of sexuality. Secularism is there. These people don't believe in that kind of caste system, that kind of division, which affects a large number of people in India. Then there is a stylized presentation of emotions for courtly entertainment. There are poets in the later medieval period, who like Bihari is a poet who is there, I think, in the 7th century. So he is a court poet, and he has to write, poetry and recite it in the court, and then he has to go by the emotions which he will evoke, which he will create, in his poems. So there can be love poems, there can be other poems, etc. And well, it can be mostly Shringar, because the court would like Shringar, that is the idea of beauty, the woman's beauty, and therefore that will be the theme of poetry. And finally, and this is important, and this sets Indian writing apart from many European traditions of literature. Finally, there is a trend of nationalism, because there will be in the 20th century, early 20th century onwards, there will be nationalist poets who will talk of India as a political entity, and that political entity will set it against the common enemy, which is British imperialism. And because it's a political idea, because it's an intellectual idea, and they'll be defining what a nation is, and how this nation is different from other nations, and how it is being suppressed by a foreign power. All these things, will become subjects for poetry. So it's very difficult to write nationalist poetry. In England, there's not much of nationalist poetry, except in the smaller kingdoms like Ireland and Scotland. There you have a kind of nationalism, Scottish nationalism, Irish nationalism. But the kind of nationalism that emerged in India, the whole country rose in revolt against the British, and people started writing with the theme of nationalism uppermost in their minds. So therefore, this nationalism came to be characterized as a very specific Indian trait in the early 20th century. So we will come to this later, but then this nationalism part is to be kept in mind always. I referred to the stylized expressions of emotion. Now, in the Indian case, there is a Bhakti Kal, the Bhakti period, and there is Riti Kal. And Riti Kal means this is the conventional poetry. Conventional poetry, this is love poetry, this is comic poetry, this is sad poetry of sadness, and all those things. And because there is a Riti, there is a discipline, there is a kind of principle. So according to principles, according to prescriptions, you write poetry. So when you have to write sad poetry, when you have to write love poetry, then you keep out other emotions. So this is also a characteristic of Indian writing in India, and this draws our attention. In the 18th and 19th centuries, we were witness to unprecedented devastation, and they impressed upon the poets of the day the necessity of moving away from reality into a mystical fantasy. I am referring to the 18th century. Anybody who lived in North India in the 18th century would not feel like having an association with life, because things were so very bad, so very destructive. The period was very violent. There wasn't any state, there wasn't any sense of discipline anywhere in the country, particularly in North India, and Delhi was the center of North India then. So any invader will come loot the city of Delhi and go away, and then would leave behind, dead bodies. So Mir Taqi Mir, this Urdu poet, this lived in Delhi at that time. So he turned mystic, and he started saying, well, life is like this, I have to accept it, but then I am sad that it is there. So I will be living in a different world of my own. Mirza Ghalib is a mystic. Mirza Ghalib says things in a way which are very, very difficult to apprehend comprehend by anybody. So he goes into that kind of a trance, and then and times where Mirza Ghalib's times were equally violent, and then that devastation was there in his life and in his surroundings. So Bhakti poetry in the 19th century turned towards this kind of a self-negation, self-realization, and then that kind of sense of loneliness that was not there in the Bhakti poetry. So this was a kind of stage which Indian writing went through, and writing in India went through in the 19th century, when they had to, under some kind of a necessity, they had to reject the ordinary pleasures of life as unreal, and they had to create an alternative world of their own where they could breathe relatively easy. So this is what Mir Taqi Mir, and for instance, that famous poem which has been sung as a song in Hindi film, and which is sung by different people also. Mir Taqi Mir is telling his friends, he calls them Yaro, and he says, Yaro, mujhe maaf rakho, main nashe mein hoon. Please don't come near me, don't talk to me. I am in a state of intoxication. So this person, wants to tell people that he doesn't want to have any dialogue with them. So please keep me out of your pleasures, and I'm with myself. I'm quite happy, and I want to remain lonely. So this kind of a thing is the crux of 18th and 19th century life that Mir Taqi Mir and Mirza Ghalib lived. Then I've already indicated, and friends, now I'm winding up with the last part of the writing in India, and this has two sections to it. One is called the Great Nationalist Trend, which is starting from 1880 to 1947, 1950, and in this you have a large number of writers who are taking up social themes, political themes, and not talking about the individual as much as others would. There are of course individual writers then, but then they remain in the background, and they are all the time on the defensive. They have to tell why they are individualistic, and they can, well, I don't want to go into that particular phase in this discussion, but you think of these writers all over India, and I'm not naming only writers from one or two particular languages. For instance, in Bangla, in the early 20th century, there is a great deal of novel writing or fiction. It's there in Bangla, it's there in Marathi, it's there in Malayalam, it's there in Hindi, it's in Urdu, it's in English, and in Gujarati. In the context, writers that come to mind include Bankim, the 19th century writer, Tagore, 19th and 20th century, Fakir Mohan Senapati, Odia writer, Premchand, Hindi writer, Manto, Urdu writer, R.K. Narayan, English writer, Nanak Singh, Punjabi writer, Mulkraj Anand, a Punjabi writing in English, Krishna Chandra, a Punjabi and also Urdu writer, and Raja Rao, a writer from Karnataka. So these writers, all of them wrote about the nationalistic themes, and I've chosen them particularly in a certain pattern, that they come from different parts of India. They have grown on different languages. They use either their original language or some other language, and they all have this common factor of nationalism in them. So they are talking about their country, they are talking about their life. So in a way, when you put them together, then that becomes writing in India. So this writing is well integrated, and the integration occurs at the level of politics, at the level of thought, which is always independence centered. This is about the fiction writers, the novelists and short story writers. Now come to poetry in the 20th century. It starts with 19th century poets such as Derozio and Torugat. Then Iqbal is both 19th and 20th century. Sare Jahan Se Acha, that's the famous song by him. Then Subramanya Bharati, a Tamil poet who writes about in India's urge to become independent and to attain dignity. You have Sarojini Naidu writing in English, but also taking part in nationalist politics. She was a recognized, established political leader. Then you have Maithili Sharan Gupta. He tells people, about pride in one's own country, and he writes in either couplets, like there is a famous poem, long poem called Bharat Bharati, and this is in dohas, and all these dohas, are strung together as a kind of longish, discourse on nationalism. And this was in fact the people who read him in the 1920s and before, those people had most of his couplets by heart. Then there is a Urdu poet called Makhdoom, a revolutionary poet. Then Faiz Ahmad Faiz, another revolutionary poet. Then there is Nirala, that great Suryakant Tripathi Nirala, writing in Hindi, and his dimensions were epic dimensions. And there is Firag Gorakhpuri. Firag Gorakhpuri is actually Raghupati Sahai, that's his name, but he assumed this name Firag Gorakhpuri, and he wrote wonderful poetry in the anyway. Now I'll just viewers, because we are reaching the end of the discussion, so I'll just name these people in the 20th century. Then you have 20th century, the second part of the 20th century was occupied by certain writers like Tara Shankar, Yashpal, Vimal Mitra, Amitabh Ghosh, Salman Rushdie, Anant Murthy, Atiya Hussain. These are the people. Then you have poets, Mukti Bodh, Shankar Kurup, Shamsher Bahadur Singh, Shri Shri, Kamla Das, Nagarjun, Trilochan. Then you have dramatists, Badal Sarkar, Girish Karnad, Mohan Rakesh. Then you have Dalit writing of the subalterns. You have, what I say at the end, and in just 1 minute, is that in the present period, that is starting from 1947 up to the present day, you have a great deal of heterogeneity. Now that, the nationalism which bound things together and which, kept the themes, so very focused that one could identify with them at a larger level, that is missing in the latter half of the 20th century and now. So there is more of diversity and heterogeneity, and people are writing about their experiences, and they put their experiences somewhat different from others, and there is a great deal of experimentation and exploration. But what I say about the present writing is that this kind of a writing has the potentiality to get together again into some kind of a unified understanding that will reject any attack on dignity, any attack on independence. So this is how writing in India has emerged, traveled from the ancient period up to the present, and I thought this will be a working kind of introduction for us as we discuss other aspects, poets or texts later. Thanks.
Thank you so much, sir. That found, in fact, a very wonderful introduction to our series on writing in India, and I will request you all to stay tuned in as we discuss more writers, poets, and many more things with that. And with this, I'd like to bring this to a close, and thank you so much, sir, for being here, and thank you all for watching. Thank you.